Hey you guys, Jill here. Welcome back to Whispering Willow Farm. Today I'm in my kitchen preserving the harvest. So if you caught last week's vlog, you know that we harvested 83 pounds of food from our tunnel in 1 week. So I am having to quickly be thinking about how to preserve that so it doesn't go bad, because we are growing all this food to be able to stock it in our pantries, in our freezers, can it, ferment it, and really just have longevity out of the food that we're growing right now throughout the fall and the winter months. So I have got a whole bunch of cherry tomatoes behind me, and I'm going to be preserving these using 2 different methods. The first method I'm going to put in the dehydrator, and I'm using my friend Jessica over at Roots and Refuge. She has got a recipe for this. I'll find it and link it in the description. So I've got probably 2 pounds or so going in the dehydrator, and then behind me in this big bucket, this big bowl, I have got 4.5 pounds, and I'm going to be making these cherry bombs, which is actually a fermented recipe. So we ferment a lot of food around here for a few different reasons. The main reason being just how good it is for your gut health. So when you ferment food instead of canning it, so let's say pickles for instance, you can hot water bath or even pressure can pickles, but you take out a lot of that nutritional value. Or you can ferment it and you're adding all these prebiotics and all these probiotics, and it's just really building and healing your gut health, and it tastes just as good. In my opinion, it is much simpler to ferment your food than can it. So that's kind of our number one way to preserve our food. But something to be mindful of is a lot of times when you are fermenting these foods, they'll sit on the counter until they have completely become fermented, but then when you remove the weight and you put your lid on, you are going to have to store them in a refrigerator of some kind. And so that might be one reason that you don't want to ferment your foods, is that you do not have the storage space in your fridge. Now we do have an additional fridge just for like cold storage. We also have a freezer that we converted into a cooler for when we were doing a bulk of our flower production in the summer, but we won't be utilizing that in the fall and winter, so we'll kind of use that as additional storage. But one of my favorite books, this was actually sent to me from a viewer. It's Fermented Vegetables. I'll find it and link it in the description. This is one of the most resourceful, useful books I think I own when it comes to preserving. There's another book I have that's all about freezing. My friend wrote it. I'll also link it and put it down. But if you're wanting to ferment foods, this tells you the history behind it. This tells you the different equipments that you need, which is really important as far as like crocks and weights. And then it breaks down every single vegetable from A to Z that you could think about growing. It tells you a few different ways to ferment and preserve those. So today we're going to be doing the cherry bombs. So let's get started. First off, we're going to do the dehydrated cherries. What I am going to do is just line my dehydrator trays, which I have right here, with parchment paper, because I was reading her recipe and some of the notes said that the juice can fall and then you're having to clean your dehydrator. So I can just use the parchment paper, and then I can save this and keep using this same parchment paper over and over again for the rest of the cherry tomatoes I do this way this season. So that's what I'm gonna do. So when it comes to dehydrating the cherry tomatoes, there are a few different ways I could preserve them. I could dehydrate them and immediately throw them in the fridge and just use them with like recipes, things like that. Or I could take and store them in olive oil. So I could put them in like a half gallon or a quart jar, however many I end up having, and fill it all with oil to where it's covering all of the tomatoes, and then it'll be shelf stable for a year. And then obviously when I open those, I will need to move it to the refrigerator. And so that's actually what I'm going to be doing today. These are just going to go on the pantry. When I think about wanting to add them to a dish throughout the fall and the winter, I'll go and grab them and then stick them in the fridge. Alright, so the one thing that I really liked about this recipe is that, one, it was pretty flexible as far as what you can do. So I'm rinsing the cherry tomatoes, I'm going to pat them down, but then it calls for just like half a teaspoon of salt. So I've got my Redmond salt here. And then you could do a seasoning or you could do some oil. So I've got this Tuscan herb oil, and because it is so flavorful, I'm gonna use this and opt out of the seasoning. So I'll do 2 tablespoons of this, and I wanna say it was like a half a teaspoon of the salt. Then I'm gonna cut them in half, throw them in my massive bowl, and just toss them together really well. So pretty simple there. You could really explore with different seasonings. If you do a lot of Asian dishes, you could do a lot of different like Asian seasonings, or you know, you could spice it up with like some paprika and some chili powders. There's a lot of different things you could do, but we're just kind of making this as generic as possible, pretty much, so that it could go with a lot of different pasta dishes and be pretty neutral. So I should note that the recipe called for 50 cherry tomatoes. I'm not counting these. I just weighed out what I needed for the cherry bombs, and then anything left over was what I wanted to dehydrate. So, oh no, I just lost the cherry tomato to my coffee. So I'm not counting how many these are, and if I need to adjust and add more oil and salt, I will. I'm just kind of eyeballing it and gauging it. All right, so this was certainly more than 50 cherry tomatoes. So what I'm gonna do is just alter how much salt and oil that I put in here. All right, so I'm sprinkling some salt on. Alrighty. Now I'm gonna add my oil. Again, just eyeballing this. Now I'm gonna take my hands, give it a good toss, kind of feel to see what I think that the consistency should be like, and make sure it's all just coated really well. Alrighty. Give it a good toss. It smells amazing. So I think that's probably good. You guys can see here there's a lot of the oil and juice puddling at the bottom, but I think that's good. It's all well and coated. So now what we're going to be doing is taking the cherry tomatoes and just layering them on our dehydrating sheets. I am going to put these in single layers here. And I am going to put the cut side, so like on the back of some of these, I'm going to put the cut side open. Alrighty, into the dehydrator we go. I have just recently started using the dehydrator, and I can tell you all that I am a massive fan. It makes food preservation so easy and really just kind of hands off after you've done the initial work. Last tray going in. Alrighty. So now we're gonna do vegetables. We turn it on. We're gonna have the temperature at 130. We are going to set it for 12 hours and then check back in. Maybe even, let's see, 12 and a half. Alrighty. Alright guys, now that we have the first set of cherry tomatoes dehydrating, we are moving on to our fermented cherry bombs. And so I have got a gallon of our Berkey water in here, and I've got 3/4 a cup of the Redmond sea salt. Now I'm going to pour this in here, and since we're using Berkey water, it doesn't even need to come to a boil. Essentially, I'm just trying to get this salt to dissolve. So while I'm doing this, I'm going to share with you guys all the spices that we're going to be using for this recipe. Alright, so we're going to need garlic. This is garlic that we actually harvested last year. You need some peppercorns, mustard seed, ground coriander, some chili flakes, which this was the best that I had, And then it called for a sprig of fresh parsley, which I don't have, so I'm doing this. And then it also calls for 5 to 6 stems of basil. So I'm gonna run out into the garden real quick and harvest some of that. All right, I just came back in from the garden. I just got Genovese basil. The really cool thing about this basil is that this was all volunteer from last year. I didn't plant any of this, which is kind of fun, is that it all just is volunteer and comes back. But there was so much of it out there that I definitely need to be thinking about drying this and putting this up so that we can use in pestos and things like that in the winter as well. All right, so the first thing we're gonna do is wash all of our cherry tomatoes and then start stuffing them in the jars. Now this is going to make a gallon. So I do have some half-gallon ball jars. I could do that. But recently I went out of town and stopped at this fun little homesteading supply store, and I was able to grab all of these Wex jars incredibly cheap. These are my favorite canning jars, and truthfully, it's not because their performance is so great, it's just because they are so sweet and just so cute, and they come in all these little funky shapes and sizes, and it just makes me so happy, and sometimes that's worth it. So I'm gonna do a half-gallon in here because that makes the most sense. But then I've got a couple of these I'm gonna fill up too, just because I think it's gonna be really pretty just sitting there full of little cherry tomatoes. So let's get busy washing and then packing. So we're gonna pack all of ours, and that'll kind of give you a good idea of how many jars you're gonna need as well. So the recipe did say that it was okay to use under-ripened cherry tomatoes. They actually said that that was preferred over a super, super ripe tomato. So you could harvest them when they were yellow, which is really nice too if you want to have some super ripe ones for fresh eating. You can go ahead and like harvest some of the ones that are slightly underripe to make these cherry bombs, and then save the ripe ones just to go out and eat as a snack or maybe cook up with dinner. Some of these are a bit ripe, but I'm gonna go ahead and test it anyways, because when it comes to anything, I like to test the limits and see. So there's only a few of these that I would say are like super like, okay, that's really ripe, but I don't really know what it's gonna do, so I'm just gonna try a couple and see what happens. So I would encourage you guys, if you are growing a large amount of one variety, try different ways to preserve and to consume that variety. So for us, we grow a lot of tomatoes. Now, I am not the one that likes to just snack on tomatoes and just eat it, you know, with garnish with some fresh finishing salt. That is not what I prefer at all, but we do cook with a lot of tomatoes, and I do enjoy cooking with those tomatoes and the flavors that they bring. But one thing I am always thinking of, since we are growing a bulk amount, is what are some different ways I can be preserving these? What are different ways I can prepare these for my family to where they'll take on different notes? And so these cherry bombs are a fun little way to do that, right? Instead of just eating a tomato raw, which my children don't like either. My children wouldn't eat a beet raw, but they love fermented beets. My kids eat fermented cucumbers, carrots, kohlrabi. They eat sauerkraut. And it's because when you ferment food, it takes on a totally different flavor note, and my children actually really love that. So I would encourage you, if you are growing a lot of one thing, just find different ways to preserve it, find different ways to cook it up in your kitchen. I never really realized how versatile food was until I started growing it myself and playing around with the different ways you could cook it up, and then it was just like, oh my gosh, there is a endless world of possibility. And I'm just now really this year, has cooking piqued my interest? Has, you know, finding new ways to preserve, just trying out new recipes is something I'm really interested in this year. And it's been really fun just to see how amazing the food tastes when it's preserved in all these different ways. All right, so we've got our cherry tomatoes stuffed in all of our canning jars. So I ended up having 2 of these little squatty jars and then 1 of the big one. So this is gonna be really nice. So now what I'm going to do is add the parsley, the basil, the garlic, all the different spices into each of these. I am going to hover over this recipe real quick, that way you guys can see the exact measurement. If you are wanting to recreate this at home, you can just screenshot this right here or pause it and write it down. But now I'm just going to get to filling them. Alrighty, here we have our packed little tomato basil. Now I will note too that on the mustard seed and the coriander seed it did call for seed, and I only had it ground down into powder, so I went ahead and added it anyways. I'm going to keep notes to see if I think that affected anything at all. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that my brine is cool. I'm going to pour it over the top. One very important thing when you're fermenting things is that you want to make sure that your brine is covering whatever it is that you're trying to ferment. And also too, since I'm doing these in individual jars, I'm going to be adding a weight to these. So I'll add a weight in here, put a lid on it, and then I'll let it ferment on the counter for about 6 to 8 days. You'll start to notice that it's getting really cloudy, your brine is, and then your tomatoes are starting to like lose color. When that is the case, probably on day 6, I'll start to test these and see how they taste. If they don't taste fermented or kind of have that sour, pickly type taste, then I'll let them keep going for a few days. But once they are ready, you'll simply remove the weight, put on a lid, and pop these in the refrigerator and just eat them as needed. Alright guys, just like that, I have made these stunning cherry bombs. Look at this. When I tell you it's worth the expense, granted, I did get these on like crazy good sale, but doesn't that just make your heart happy? It certainly does mine. So this was a little bit of an experiment because I was using the powdered spices instead of the seed spices, but all in all, it's gonna be edible. I do think it's important to keep a notebook in your kitchen so you can jot down notes. I do this a lot with bread baking. If I alter the fermenting times or maybe different ingredients I put in, if that affects the fermentation or the rise or whatever, I think it's just good to have those notes to reference. Same with fermenting. It's good to know, especially on the duration of your ferment. You know, some fermenting can last up for like 2 weeks, but if you don't like it that fermented, you can cut that back. So anything listed or mentioned in this video today will be down. There'll be a link down in the description below, but I hope this shows you guys a couple easy ways you can preserve your cherry tomatoes. I know it doesn't make a lot of sense to like can those because it's so time intensive, but there's a lot of different things you can do to preserve those cherry tomatoes to ensure you're going to be eating them throughout the fall and the winter. But thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I'll talk to you soon.